I want to talk about bow hunting, the signing phase. You ever heard of the signing phase? You probably haven't. Jeff at HuntWise, Dylan and I, we had a discussion, and we really wanted to name this period of time because the October lull is so long. October lull can begin in September if your bow season begins in early September, because the October lull is a direct result of hunting pressure. It's not some magical thing that happens in the woods. It's not reality. It's just a myth. The symptoms of the October lull are caused by hunting pressure, but there's a period of time where the October lull is waning, it's moving on, and all of a sudden you see that explosion of rubs and scrapes in the woods. And there's several points you need to remember about this period of time. And I'm going to say this period of time can take place from the 15th to the 20th. It can take place from the 10th to the 20th of October. Sometime around in there, about a week, maybe even 2 weeks, where you see some sign explode and you think, boy, the rut's about to happen. You hit your stands too early, you put pressure on your land, and it's at a time where you can't afford to put any pressure on your land. It's a time where you need to be letting your land soak. They need to be hunting very smart, especially as it gets closer to the rut. A lot of people are just throwing caution to the wind when they get into the rut, and when it gets closer to the rut, you can't do that. In fact, when you get to the rut, you need to learn to manage the rut. Look at the rut like a marathon, not a sprint, as well as the entire season. The signing phase is that period of time right before the pre-rut where bucks try to tempt you and lure you into the woods and sit in your favorite tree stands before they're really moving at daylight during the pre-rut. We're down here in Kentucky, and I was talking about with one of the main guides. It's kind of cool to talk to guys that are actually in the woods every single day, trying to make sure that people kill bucks and have a good time doing so, and that they're doing a good job. And it was interesting because we talked about the pre-rut activity. Well, he was saying, well, pre-rut activity, rub scrapes, they really start popping up early October, 10th of October, sometime around there. While that might be signing activity and associated with that signing phase, it's not necessarily pre-rut activity. We talked about, I said, when are those bucks actually moving between bedding areas and cruising during the daytime hours? And that's October 25th down here, October 27th, 28th. That's when the pre-rut begins, not when the first sign appears. So a lot of times people see that sign, they jump out in the woods, and that sign can vary. If you're jumping out in the woods too early, at the same time, the actual date that sign started the year before could be drastically different than this year, and there's one big main reason why. Not because the rut is different, not because pre-rut timing is different in your area, but it's because you might have had a core buck in your area that was a mature buck. Those mature bucks lay down a lot of sign. They know the game. They know when it's beginning. It's pretty easy to tell when you're out on public land right now. If you're walking around where you find some rubs and scrapes, some big rubs and scrapes, a lot of them, you know there's something mature, at least a decent age in the area. If it's a bunch of little dinks and little bucks, then there's not going to be that much sign. You've even heard in the past, yearling buck might make just a handful of rubs, a couple scrapes, that's it. Where you get into a 5-6-year-old, he might make hundreds of rubs, dozens of scrapes. As a buck ages, he lays down a lot more sign. And so that could really lure you and tempt you into thinking that, boy, the rut started this year, but it's behind this year. No, you just had different bucks in different areas laying down the same amount of sign. I always look at the timings the same. But that period of time before the pre-rut begins, when bucks are trying to tempt you to get into the woods and burn out your favorite stands before they're moving during the daylight, is called the signing phase. Signing phase, number one. You know, we saw this explosion of sign. We used to hunt every 2 weeks. We'd drive 7 hours down from the UP in Michigan, hunt southwest Wisconsin until I moved there in 2012. But we started hunting there in 2002. And we would try to go every other weekend. We'd try to go for 2 or 3 days at a time. We'd slant our days towards whichever side of the weekend was the best weather. And we'd go down. That's what we had to do with young families, managing careers, and really trying to get down for just 2 or 3 day hunt and go back. I never could hunt. I'm going to hunt 5 days down here in Kentucky, and I'm not kidding. This is the longest period of time I've hunted, I think, since 2007, when I hunted a week or 10 days down in Wisconsin before I lived there. I think it was 2006 or 7 that I was down there. I think 2006. That's the longest I've hunted at any time. We had to be very careful with when we came down. We didn't want to burn opportunities, waste our time. And we noticed a lot of missed opportunities because we would focus on coming down during the start of the peak rut, almost a rut lockdown phase, but right around November 1st, 2nd, 3rd, that would be our first, really big rut hunt, maybe the last day of October, sometime around there. What we found is we were down on the 14th, 13th, 16th of October. We came back and there was that explosion of sign. We went from seeing a handful of scrapes to 50, to more rubs than we can count. And we knew we'd missed something. And so by 2005, 2006, we started hunting the pre-rut. And we started noticing this signing phase where the sign that was left came down later. We missed a lot of opportunities. And I don't want you to miss those opportunities. If you're waiting till the rut, that early November time frame, 10th of November, whatever it might be, to shoot your bucks, you missed a lot of time in the woods of really good opportunity. That sign is a signal, a missed opportunity. You need to learn to manage that sign. And so the right time to hunt is when those bucks are actually moving between cruising bedding areas, between bedding areas, and they're cruising. One thing you really notice, so you really need to make sure, you have this opportunity of time when there's a lot of rubs and scrapes, and then that moves into that pre-rut period where you definitely need to be in the stand. Well, how do you tell when you're balancing between missed opportunities and really going with the green light into those bedding areas and hunting those morning cruising stands? Water holes are one of the best indication. And scrapes are another. If you have hidden scrapes, the mock vine scrapes that we talk about and use all the time, where bucks are routinely hitting those during the daylight anyways. A lot of guys will say, a lot of hunters will say that bucks are not hitting scrapes during the daylight. Well, most aren't. They're out on the field edges. They're not these true travel corridor scrapes like we create. Those are an indication of buck use, especially when you see a high percentage of morning activity, daylight activity. Water holes are incredible because water holes, the buck, think about it, he's sitting out in a bedding area eating acorns, might even have a little bit of corn, woody debris, hardwood regeneration, shrub tips, briars, and it's all a lot of roughage. It's hard for him to digest. So if he's sitting there in his bedding area all day, the first thing he wants to do is hit water in the evening. So we see a lot of evening water hole use in the early season all the way up until the pre-rut. But when the pre-rut begins and you're in that balance between a lot of sign on the ground and then all of a sudden the pre-rut begins, you'll see those 10 o'clock, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock during the day, middle of the day, where bucks are actually hitting water holes because they're working up a thirst from cruising. What's interesting, they'll hit it when it's cold. They're hitting it when it's 50 degrees, 40 degrees. They're not cruising when it's 80 degrees and 35-mile-an-hour winds. You'd think they'd be more thirsty, but they're not because they're sitting back in their bedding areas doing nothing. They're not working up a thirst. They're working up a thirst when it's actually cold and they're actually cruising. Learn the difference between sign here, pre-rut. Make sure you're not missing that opportunity of that pre-rut time right off the bat. And that's what we figured out, 15, 20 years ago, that we needed to be there at that pre-rut time. We needed to not not miss it. And we found that those cold fronts that we follow on HuntCast, we found that when those cold fronts pop up, and I say HuntCast a lot, and I'm going to, because this algorithm and the formula that's infused into HuntCast is mine. And so they've been able to take my head and what I see in the forecasted days to hunt and put it in an app. And so I think it's pretty cool. I look at it every day. This is something that saves me a lot of time because I don't have to go through charts and take 10 days or 15 days of weather and put dots of red, green, or yellow and write articles about when you should hunt, when you shouldn't, make videos. I can just simply roll through HuntCast because that's my thoughts and the formula I've used for 30 years infused in that. You need to learn exactly when that pre-rut starts. That's going to be the 20th to the 28th in most states, the end of the month, Halloween. Earlier northern, later more southern area. And that'll help you keep from missing opportunities. Patience. You see all this rub during the signing phase, all the rubs and scrapes popping up. You need to know that the pre-rut's right around the corner and those morning hunting opportunities are right around the corner. Just because there's a lot of sign popping up, you have to know the difference between the signing phase and the pre-rut. Too many people jump the gun. And again, it could be that you don't have any bucks around the area. You're not going to see that signing phase. But that's when those bucks are coming in. Patience. You can't burn out your stands. You can't push your stands. You have to save those best morning stands. It's not the pre-rut yet. It's just the signing phase. Evening food. Really concentrate on evening food. It's okay in the early season, first part of October, to take a chance on a morning stand because you have several weeks of forgiveness. Once 2 or 3 weeks have passed by in a bedding area where you bumped out a buck, he's probably okay with that intrusion 3 or 4 weeks later, or he forgets about it, whatever it might be. But I feel he goes back to his normal use of that bedding area. However, if you're spooking that buck on the 18th of October because you've been lured into the woods with a whole bunch of sign and it's a warm morning and the pre-rut hasn't begun, then you're really going to take a big risk and potentially ruin your sit. That's where the patience comes in, and that's where hitting those high quality evening food sources are critical. That's a great time to catch that buck right before the end of daylight, where he's coming into that food source he's been thinking about all day, and he's coming into that, and you have a stand that you can safely get in and out. We're not talking big food plots, big ag fields. We're talking about hidden food plots, an apple tree. If you're in an area where they bait, you're hunting a bait pile. You're hunting a hardwood regeneration area, briar patch, a white oak stand, red oak stand, whatever it might be. You're hunting that little food source that represents a pass-through on the way to something bigger, and that's a great way to capitalize on an early season, all the way up into the signing phase on a mature buck that's moving to an evening food source. Hunt the roller coaster of the weather. I do that all season long, but the difference between the signing phase and the pre-rut and what follows is that the early season, again, you can afford to spook deer by doing the wrong thing. You can hunt deer in hot days where there's not going to be deer and leave your scent around. Again, there's several weeks of forgiveness, but when it comes into this time period, I hunt with the roller coaster of the weather all year long. I've been doing that since the early 90s. I'm not kidding. For 3 decades, this is how I've hunted. And so I hunt purely by the roller coaster weather. I found that to be the best way to manage my family and career, where I wasn't spending a lot of time on poor days. I learned to actually be flexible with my boss at the time, and I hunt more on this side of the weekend or this side. I take one day during the week instead of taking a long weekend, whatever it might be. But I learned to hunt the weather and match it into my family and career, so it wasn't actually away from the family and my career more than I needed to be to actually enjoy my hunting. When I went hunt the roller coaster of the weather all season long, and it's going to lead you to success. We talk about that in many different ways on this channel. I've been giving weather forecasts for 12 to 15 years. I have my all-weather whitetail book that I published in 2018. And then, of course, Huntcast. I've been focusing on the weather before anyone else was even talking about it online. You can look at it. I have forecasts going back for 12, 15 years, but it's something that I've been passionate about for 30 years. And hunting by the roller coaster of weather will lead you to success more than any other factor that you can find several times more. And you can use that to guide you to success for the rest of your life. Hey, sorry to interrupt this video, but my web class series is finally begun. How to design your whitetail property is on my website, and there's a link in the description. Please check it out. The morning explosion is just around the corner. Just because you have the signing phase and lots of rubs and scrapes are popping up, again, learn to identify when the pre-rut actually takes place. We give you those dates on Huntcast in your area, but they'll happen at the same time every year. Again, there might be some variance depending on if you have an old buck or young bucks in the area and how much sign each one's going to leave. Those old bucks will lay down a lot of sign. But once that takes place, that patience is going to pay off, because you're going to head to those morning stands, and 75% of my bucks are shot around bedding areas, morning stands, and the most mature bucks. And that's when that explosion of morning activity is going to take place, and make sure that you pay attention to it. Random rut activity. What I like about this signing phase is that, yes, bucks are laying down a lot more scent or sign. They're laying down sign in the forms of rubs and scrapes and activity. You'll find little bursts. We saw a little 2-year-old 8-point last night. He was a small one, but he was out there, and you see those does running away from him, those fawns, and yeah, he wasn't that ruddy, but you see the rubs off to the side. You see him moving around out there like he was king. Of course, there was nothing bigger out there, and that's why he thought he was king. But you see those little bursts of random rut activity when they do come out in daylight, and that makes them more susceptible. Again, this is a great time to go after bucks in the evening over those food sources on a cool evening. I especially like to focus if you're hunting fields or field edges, those shady sides where they're not exposed to the sun, and that's where you'll find a high percentage of bucks moving before dark. Again, this is not the pre-rut. The signing phase can really mislead you into thinking that you need to go out and hit your pre-rut stands. Just because there's a lot of rubs and scrapes in the woods on October 8th doesn't mean it's the pre-rut. There's nothing magical happening this year versus another year. In your area, let's say the pre-rut begins around October 20th. We're talking most of the time pre-rut activity, meaning bucks are actually active and moving and cruising between bedding areas. Until they're doing that, the pre-rut hasn't begun. And you're looking at that activity to take place a lot more during the daylight when the conditions are cool and favorable to long range cruising. Even if that buck only stays in 10 acres, he might move 2 miles because he's going back and forth in that area on a cold morning. He's moving a lot. You're looking for those core bucks. If you don't have a core buck on your land, then expect your rutting activity to take place more during the peak rut. But we talk about on this channel a lot of ways to make sure that you're finding pre-rut activity by attracting core bucks to your land and building those core buck races. And I'm going to add one more point to all this that I should have maybe even started with. I don't know why these random thoughts come in my head of things that I should have talked about in the beginning of the video, but this one's not random. This one is big buck shift. So those big bucks, look for their shift. And this right here, this is why you see a lot of the signing phase activity. This big buck shift right down here. Bucks are moving into their fall territory. I would say, I've talked about the annual whitetail shift. I coined that phrase 10 to 12 years ago, wrote articles about it. It's called the annual whitetail shift. Been calling it that for a long time, many articles and videos. It can take place middle of September. Beans are turning yellow, last cutting of hay in ag areas up north, and those deer start to move. Hunters are getting in the woods and they move to their fall area. Sometimes they always move for fall cover and food, but they're sometimes moved by hunting pressure too, or all of the above. But definitely by the middle of October, that's when a lot of the big boys move into properties. That's in Wisconsin. We're waiting for the bucks to actually move into. We saw a new 10 point, we think it's a new 10 point last night on the cell cams, and we're seeing these new bucks start to pop up in Minnesota, and we'll see them in Wisconsin here really quick too. But that happens this time of year, and that's why you see that explosion of sign. A lot of it is caused by that big buck activity of shifting habitat, fall habitat and cover from one location to another. They actually arrive on your land, and again, you can't afford to not be patient and burn out your stands. Again, it's not the pre-rut yet. It's just these bucks coming back on your land. It's those core bucks becoming more active. Learn how to identify when the pre-rut actually begins. Make sure you actually hit that explosion of morning rut activity when the pre-rut begins. Watch the weather, play the roller coaster, hunt those evening food sources before that time. Learn how to manage your scent and stay out of the woods, hunt like a predator so that those morning stands are actually set up and have been aged like a fine wine for you to actually go in and hunt unmolested, undisturbed morning stands. Again, those first sit opportunities, I call them 40% sit opportunities. That's where most of my big whitetail hunts have taken place, and I just want that for you guys. That's why I try to deliver this information. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. We'll keep these advanced whitetail tips coming. Try to offer a lot of depth in this information so that ultimately you can become a better hunter, and that's my goal for you. I love hearing about it in the comments below. I don't always have time to answer all the comments. We get 15, 20,000 a year between the different videos. I try to answer half of them, and I really appreciate you guys commenting down below and watching the videos, and thank you so much. You make the hunting season even more enjoyable because I love the comments and I love seeing the positive feedback and definitely those success stories. Learn about the signing phase, what it means to you, learn how it transitions in the pre-rut, and you'll be on track in just a couple short weeks of monster whitetails, hopefully this fall.